Good afternoon to everybody. I guess the people actually on the call today, we more or less know each other. But anyway, my name is Jaka Sodnik from Ljubljana. I'm professor here at University of Ljubljana, Faculty of Electrical Engineering. I also do, my secondary job is basically R&D department in Nervtech, which is a Slovenian startup company developing driver simulators and offering some services on top of driving simulations, and basically a lot of research and projects that I'm going to talk about are basically shared among those two let's say entities, because we collaborate a lot on different projects on European and national level, and also majority of my team is basically doing let's say on both ends, sort of combining both things. What I want to talk about today briefly, as you're going to see, what we do, what is our focus is human factor. So how human factor impacts autonomous driving, and which are some challenges that will need to be addressed before, let's say, self-driving cars will fully reach all the roads around Europe. So just quickly, just to remember us all, we're all experts in this domain, but anyway, why do we want to actually automate driving? This is, let's say, the safety in driving is still a big issue. According to many stats, apparently still more than 1.3 million people die on roads every year. And specifically for young population between 10 and 24, this is actually #1 killer. Compared to any kind of other dangers that basically endanger these guys. It's also huge economic damage related to that. And on the other side, what automation in driving will bring us, it's definitely better utilization, better efficiency. Several independent surveys have shown so far that the current utilization of vehicles is only 20%. That means that 80% of all cars are basically parked at each moment. And that's a huge opportunity to decrease the number of cars and just organize the traffic a bit differently. And nevertheless, also comfort, of course. Many of us need like 1 hour per day to get to work. I'm such case. And so I, for example, I lose 2 hours per day just in traffic. So this also comes together with productivity, and nevertheless also mobility. The population in worldwide is getting older, and to extend the mobility of all these people, of course, that's also a big opportunity, including also people who otherwise wouldn't be able to drive. So people with different disabilities and so on. When I talk about human factor, so how does that relate to autonomous driving? The fact is that even if the cars will get fully autonomous, there will still be many other, let's say, ways of transport on the road. As we're going to see lately, Costas talked about this really nicely on the last meeting. There will be all these sorts of traffic participants who will have to coexist with cars. We're talking pedestrians, cyclists, scooters, and so on. And the new self-driving cars will have to know how to basically cope with all these forms of transport and how to share the roads. And even if we manage this, there are still big geographic and demographic differences, and specifically driving cultures. For example, a perfectly operating self-driving car in US, I'm pretty sure it will not be able to operate in Italy or in India or even more exotic, let's say, traffic places. So this is also something that will need to be incorporated through different technologies. And the one thing that we do here in Slovenia, that's one example of addressing this issue, how to incorporate also these cultural differences. So just to quickly give an overview of what's going on in Slovenia, we do also some tests in real environment. Currently, the big blocker here is the legislation part, because Slovenia is still sort of not following other neighboring countries, because Italy has done this part, Austria has done this part. We're still working on our legislation process. Hopefully, the first draft will be ready Q1 next year. I'm also part of this committee. For some reason, because the government changed actually a year and a half ago, this was already almost done, but then it's stuck, and now it's going to continue next year. Nevertheless, we have basically two private grounds where testing will take place. One is the closed polygon in Vransko. It's owned by the Slovenian Automotive Association. And the second one, which is more exciting, is the biggest shopping area, Ljubljana. With I don't know how many square kilometers is available, but as you can see on the bottom picture, it's a big live shopping area with a lot of traffic, roundabouts, pedestrians, cyclists, and so on. And this is privately owned, and this will become let's say also a closed polygon for these technologies. There is a company called AV Living Lab which will operate this. And since all the negotiation part and legislation, everything can go through this company, it's pretty easy for other OEMs to contact them and to actually run some tests here. But in Slovenia is also part of this trilateral agreement, Austrian, Hungarian, Slovenian, which is taking place in Zalazon in Hungary. So again, Slovenia is kind of following behind here. But finally, we started some processes to be more active also in this joint project proposals and so on. So due to the reason that we cannot do a lot of in real environment, what we do, we use simulation a lot. We run a lot of tests in simulated environment. As you probably know, what's the major benefit of simulation is that this is repeatable and robust environment. You can do all sorts of tests. You can do all these edge cases, critical situations, run the tests over and over again, just changing a bit of parameters and rerun the tests, and you can do this in completely safe environment. So all different tests from physical sensors to different machine learning algorithms, everything is done in simulation. Also, in our case, when we actually focus on human factor, on human in the loop testing, we also run tests through driving simulators. What we're operating here, this is, for example, this is NerfTech simulator that we developed. It's small, compact, motion-based, but it's pretty immersive, and it actually gives a person feeling of being in a real car and getting immersed in this driving situation. This is just an example of an insight. So there is different versions, but we actually have some physical cockpit with some external HMI devices, which enable us to do real-time HMI studies also. So how these different secondary tasks, also how do they impact drivers' performance. The simulator that we use is also equipped with a bunch of sensors. So we also do physiological measurements. So we are able to also, let's say, get this human body response to different situations. What we typically measure by default is the eye tracking part. So to know exactly what the person is looking at. This is probably the most richest information that you can get from the driver, to be able to see how do they perceive environment, what did they see, what did they focus on, and so on. And also other stuff such as heart rate variability, galvanic skin response. All these parameters gives us a good estimate of the stress level, of the drowsiness, and all these, let's say, external factors that also impact drivers' performance. One of the projects that's currently running in Slovenia that I would like to mention, it's actually ending next year, but it's a project which is ran by our university, Ljubljana. The collaborating is also University of Maribor, their psychology department. And there are basically three companies who are co-financing this. The biggest insurance company in Slovenia, called Triglav, the National Automotive Association, and the NerfTech that I mentioned before, the startup company with simulators. The aim of this project is to develop, to use the simulator to be able to profile drivers. So basically to put a driver in a simulated session and to see, simply speaking, how good of a driver you are. How do you score? What are your pros and cons, and what basically could be improved, or let's say in your personal driving skills and so on. The general idea here is to do all that automatically. So the driver is exposed to this simulated session. All the data is getting recorded together with the physiological responses, and then the system at the end basically just spits out the automatic basically score. We call this a risk assessment score. So there is a bunch of parameters that are recorded. These are parameters related to driving, such as, I don't know, your speed violation, the safety distance, your acceleration profile, your violation of traffic rules. Then if you had any accidents, there are also some basically parameters related to your eye tracking data. So did you notice a traffic sign? How did you react to the traffic signs? And then also some physiological responses, such as your heartbeat and so on. So all this big pool of parameters, this is then aggregated to a bunch of, let's say, categories. As you can see on this graph, categories such as attention, driving aggression, alertness, stress level, and so on. And then in the final step, these categories are aggregated again. And the final output is the so-called personal or risk assessment score. So basically, let's say if you're a bit driver, we can tell you what makes you a bit driver. What are your pros and cons, and why do you think some aspects of driving should be improved, and some of them should simply be, let's say, as they are, because they are pretty good. So this is the idea, to have the automatic scoring mechanism. The use cases that we are working on and using this algorithm is one is the insurance company that I mentioned before. So they are using this on daily basis. They are inviting young drivers who are candidates for the first insurance policy, and they go to this test, and if they perform well, they get a discount offered by the insurance company. The final goal here is to have a certain threshold, so they have to collect a certain number of points to get this reducted fee. Right now, because this is still in the testing phase, as soon as they take the tests and they take this seriously, they get some discount from the insurance company. So just to get enough drivers to test the systems, and for us also to collect data. The second case that we started running in UK, in London, is with Uber drivers. So we had a primary pilot last month, and we're getting a bigger pilot in January. So we're inviting professional Uber drivers again to make these tests to see how do they perform. And in this case, the UK insurance company, which is called Insure, which is, by the way, they want to be like exclusive Uber insurance company in UK. They actually want to use this as a basically screening process for new drivers, because in UK the Uber drivers, they already have some. It's quite a big procedure before they get a license. It's a lot of tests that they have to do, and this will be one additional test where they will actually be exposed to, let's say, sort of a real driving, and the system will tell basically what are, let's say, what kind of a drivers they are. So Uber agreed to participate in this pilot, and we're looking forward to this case. And the third one, this is a special case because it's a national rehabilitation center. So in this case, we are testing basically drivers after severe brain injuries who are invited to rehab center to do some psychological testing. And then the psychologist and neurologist, they basically decide whether they should still continue driving or not. And they set the final diagnosis. And in our case, we want to substitute this, or let's say, or complement this decision-making process by also exposing them to simulated driving and trying to see how basically if their driving can still be improved, or if they are still basically safe enough to be back on the streets. So this is the third pilot. What's important in that we're running these pilots in different countries with different populations of drivers, and we're collecting a massive amount of data doing this. So far, we had more than 2,000 participants, different driver profiles, and by using all this data, we are working basically on modeling all this different driver behavior in different situations. So another use case when we basically try to monetize this all this data that we collect through some machine learning algorithms, we are able to create clones or digital avatars of specific drivers. Let's say if there is a specifically poor driver or a specifically good driver, we can make a digital clone of this driver, put it back in simulation, and then see how it performs in basically, let's say, in different environments when this driver was not originally driving, and get some feedback of how she or he would perform. And on the other hand, why this is also interesting is by cloning this human behavior in simulation, we are able to test completely third-party driving algorithm. Let's say if you imagine you have a Volkswagen self-driving algorithm, which can drive an ego vehicle in our simulation. This vehicle can be exposed to all these different profiles of drivers, for which we claim are pretty good representatives of real drivers. So it's sort of like testing AV in a human in the loop testing. Just that we basically substitute real humans who could drive these simulated vehicles by algorithms, basically by their clones. So maybe this is just one video which is sort of showcasing this. Let's say this is a reckless driver, which is being tested in a simulator. This is example of a really careful driver. So each driver has a specific properties, specific behavior features that we capture through this simulated driving. So this is an example of a screening process. How do we collect this? And then in the second part, as you said, we make clones of these drivers, and we just want to see how do they perform. So for example, in this case, the white car that we saw, this was an example of an external algorithm which is being tested in this driving environment. Okay, another case that I would mention here briefly, some studies that we did in collaboration with US, which is taking into consideration these intercultural differences. So those were two independent studies, one with University of Washington from Seattle, and the other one from Virginia Tech, so from Virginia. These are more on level 3 driving, when we have a driver in a self-driving car. But then at one point, the car demands to take over from the driver to start operating the vehicle. And we were trying to see how to communicate this takeover to a driver, what kind of display to use, what kind of warning system to use, and so on. So I'm not going to talk about the HMI here. That's not really a case, but more on what we noticed and what was really, really surprising to us, to actually such huge cultural differences. For example, in this takeover situation, when the car started, let's say, alarming the person to take over, what was interesting that in Slovenia, quite many people in panic, they just started braking, while there was quite significant percentage of people who actually grabbed the steering wheel and tried to steer a vehicle away from the obstacle, try to save the vehicle not to crash. While in US, basically people, everybody, without an exception, the only thing they try to do, they're just starting to brake. And that exactly repeated in Virginia and in Washington. So we were surprised after the first study that was coincidence. But then after 2 studies, it seems like maybe that's a sort of a driving school issue that they don't know. They don't really teach US students how to react in critical situations. And also, interestingly, the reaction time, where people basically react to these alarms, there was a significant difference between US and Europe. So that's definitely something that's probably very interesting to observe. Another study, when we also actually focused on real driving, I don't know if you're familiar, the Aachen University from Germany, I think approximately 2 years ago, they released the HID dataset. This is the dataset that was collected with drones, with cameras on German highways. And it's basically, it has, I think it's altogether approximately 60 recordings. But then they ran some algorithms to extract the actual trajectories out of this. So you don't have to deal with videos. You actually deal with, let's say, CSV files, so the actual recordings of over 100,000 trajectories of vehicles. So this is a really nice, perfect data set to play with, to observe what is the actual real traffic in Germany. And we, together with Virtual Vehicle, the Austrian company, we did almost half year of investigation of this data set to try to see how does this look like. And we've also come up with some interesting observings that, for example, in Germany, yeah, it's important to say that these highway sections, they are all with speed limit, because in Germany quite many highways doesn't have a speed limit, but in this case there was a speed limit. And interestingly, basically big majority of drivers, they don't obey this speed limit. So the general speed of the drivers is always approximately 10% higher than the speed limit. And also the safety distance is never basically the one that's, let's say, advised for safe traffic, but it's also a little bit shorter. So why this is important? Because our long-term goal here is to try to find what are these properties that need to be incorporated in self-driving cars, because the virtual vehicle, they are pretty strong in on designing algorithms for self-driving cars, and they were trying to see which of this real life behavior needs to be incorporated in order for self-driving car to function properly. For example, if you would put a self-driving car in this situation, which would drive exactly to the speed limit and with exactly the required safety distance, it would probably make a mess, because it would make a traffic jam just because it reacts differently than the other traffic participants. The idea that we had in this project was to be able to score each individual vehicle. In this case, we were scoring humans, but of course, the long term is to have a score, independent score for self-driving cars. So whenever you put a self-drive on a car, you take a certain recordings of this car and try to see how it behaves in a real traffic. We call this AV safety score, which is composed of different, in this case, maneuvers. So we score separately how this car follows other cars, how does perform overtaking, free driving, mitigation, and so on. I'm not going into the details, but just to give an idea what do we want to do here, basically to be able to have a score for each individual car. The long-term idea is to be able to implement this in real world. So let's say if you have a traffic cameras, which record the cars on a certain area of highways, to be able to get up with this score more or less immediately. And this is the idea. What we also observed is, of course, one of the aspects is how this score performs over time. So what would be the score if you have like 3 seconds of recording, if you have 1 minute of recording, or if you have 2 hours of recording of individual vehicle? So what would be the score? Does it stay consistent, or does it basically change a lot? For example, if you have a pretty high score for a specific car, and then this car at one point does something really crazy, like a really crazy danger maneuver, what happens with the score? Does it just basically decreases in moment, or you basically there is some time before the score can be changed, and so on? These are all questions that we are asking here. And the next step from here is, in addition to safety score, to come up also with agility score. By agility, we want to see how this specific car impacts other cars, or basically how behavior of individual vehicle, how does it impact other vehicles around. And this is also, I think, closely related to what we want to do also in WISE Act, because if we want to see wider impact, we want to see how individual behavior of autonomous vehicle, how does it impact the surroundings, and basically what needs to be which individual properties will need to be considered also on the bigger scale. And this is more or less basically the last slide that I have here. I can see I was a little bit too long. We said 20 minutes, but it was 30 minutes. I apologize for that, but I'm closing it here, at least with my part of talking.